Welcome to a true Uber horror story. The city lights blurred into streaks as Mark, an Uber driver by night, navigated the familiar labyrinth of downtown. The hum of his engine in the distant city murmur were his companions, a stark contrast to the quiet dread that had become an unwelcome passenger in his life. It had been nearly a year since that night, the night he picked up Derek, but the memory, like a phantom limb, still throbbed with an inexplicable ache. He had tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as an isolated, unsettling encounter, but the truth was it had fundamentally altered something within him. Every silent passenger, every dimly lit pickup, now carried the ghost of that Friday in October. He remembered the sterile quiet of the bowling alley parking lot, the way Derek had materialized under the solitary, light a silhouette against the darkness, his voice flat and devoid of inflection, still echoed in Mark's mind, just needed to get out of there. And then the ominous abandoned house, the unsettling request to wait here, and the inexplicable detour that felt less like a change of plans and more like a macabre game. The strangest part was the eerie silence, or the unexpected house. It was the feeling of palpable tension that coiled in the car, tightening with every passing minute. It was Derek's eyes in the rearview mirror, not looking out at the passing world, but fixed unblinking on Mark's reflection. And then the chilling question delivered with such disarming calm: you ever wonder how you're going to die? Mark shivered despite the warmth of the car's heater. He'd tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it as a morbid joke, but there had been no humor in Derek's eyes, only a profound, unsettling contemplation. "You picked the wrong guy up tonight," the words whispered just before Derek vanished into the shadows had been a parting gift, a curse that had burrowed deep into Mark's psyche. He had reported it to Uber, of course. The blank name, the missing trip data, the dismissive explanation of an app crash or rider cancellation. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to erase the encounter, to make Mark question his own sanity. But he knew what he had seen, what he had felt, the primal fear, the certainty that he had brushed against something profoundly wrong. The next few months had been a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid glances in his rearview mirror. He started carrying a small, discreet pepper spray canister in his console, a tiny, almost laughable defense against the intangible dread that now rode shotgun with him. He tried to pick up fewer night shifts, but the bills still piled up, a constant reminder of the precariousness of his life. One sweltering July evening, almost 9 months after the Derek incident, Mark found himself in a familiar situation: a late night pickup, a quiet side street, and a solitary figure waiting. The name on the app was Chris. Mark's heart gave a familiar lurch. He pulled up, and the man hoodie pulled low got into the back seat without a word. Deja vu, a cruel trick of the mind, washed over Mark. Chris was as silent as Derek, as unsettlingly still. The destination was a suburban neighborhood far from the city lights, and as they drove, Mark noticed the faint glow of a phone in Chris' lap. It wasn't a casual glance at texts. It was a steady, unblinking beam pointed subtly upwards towards Mark's seat. "Everything all right back there?" Mark asked, the words feeling hollow and forced. A mumbled "yeah" was the only reply, and the light extinguished. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than the summer night air. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He could feel the hairs on his arms standing on end, the familiar chill creeping up his spine. This was it, he thought. This was the night. They arrived at the destination, a dark house, no lights, no signs of life. Mark repeated his question, his voice strained. Chris stared out the window, a statue of unsettling calm. Finally, a nod. Mark put the car in park, his fingers hovering over the door lock. Chris finally opened the door, but he didn't get out. He just stood there, the door ajar, facing the dark house. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. He was about to tell him to close the door, to get out, when Chris turned, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp from down the road. "I need to go back," Chris said, his voice flat, emotionless. Mark's mind raced back. Where you picked me up." A familiar pattern, the bizarre request, the utter lack of reason. Mark told him he'd have to request a new ride, but Chris' gaze was unwavering. "Please, I need to go back." "You need to request it through the app," Mark insisted, his voice trembling slightly. That's when Chris uttered the words that sent a fresh wave of ice through Mark's veins, words that echoed with an unnerving resonance. "I can't, they're not gone yet." "Who's not gone?" Mark asked, a part of him desperate to understand, another part terrified of the answer. Chris didn't reply. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the dark house. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just unsettling, it was genuinely disturbing. He repeated his insistence about the app, and after another agonizing moment, Chris slowly backed away and closed the door. He walked towards the house, a dark figure, swallowed by the oppressive blackness of the porch. The moment Chris reached the porch, Mark threw the car into reverse and sped away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ended the trip, the app confirmation, a small hollow victory. A few blocks down, his hand still shaking, Mark pulled into a 24-hour gas station. He needed to clear his head to process the escalating weirdness of his life. He locked the doors, a futile gesture he knew, and went inside. 4 minutes. That's all it took. 4 minutes to use the restroom, to grab a cold drink. 4 minutes for his world to once again be turned upside down. He walked back to his car, the familiar white sedan, and his vision blurred. Chris. He was in the back seat, sitting there in the same hoodie, the same unnervingly blank expression. Mark's mind reeled. Had locked the doors. He was sure of it. He stood frozen in the gas station, lights reflecting in Chris unblinking, eyes through the rear window. Slowly, deliberately, Mark opened the driver's side door, his eyes never leaving Chris' reflection. How did you get back in? Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Take me back, Chris said, his voice as flat as before. Calling the cops. Mark said, his hand already reaching for his phone. Then Chris leaned forward, his face close to the back of Mark's seat, close enough for Mark to feel his breath, cold and clammy on the back of his neck. They're still in the house? Mark froze. The phrase so simple, so devoid of menace, yet so utterly chilling. He didn't call the police. Something in Chris' voice, a raw, desperate undertone, hinted at something beyond malice. It sounded like pure, unadulterated terror. Whose house is that? Mark asked, his voice barely audible. My parents'. Do you live there? Not anymore. The hairs on Mark's neck prickled. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to flee, to abandon the car, to run as fast as he could. But another stranger impulse, a morbid curiosity, perhaps, held him captive. He started driving back towards the dark house, every part of him screaming in protest. The silence in the car was broken only by the rhythmic thumping of his own terrified heart and Chris' increasingly ragged breathing. Chris began to rock slightly in the back seat, a slow, almost imperceptible sway. At one point he whispered so faintly that Mark almost missed it. They're still there. They won't leave no matter what I do. When they pulled up to the house again, it was still a black void, a gaping maw in the night. Chris got out without a word, a silent apparition, and walked to the front door. He didn't knock, didn't try the handle. He just stood there, a solitary figure facing an invisible horror. Mark waited, his foot hovering over the accelerator. 30 seconds felt like an hour. Then with a sudden, decisive movement, he pulled away, making absolutely certain the doors were locked this time. He drove 3 blocks, parked under a lone street light, and sat there, the engine idling, his mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. He debated calling the cops again, but what would he say? That a silent man got into his car twice, spoke in riddles, and claimed his dead parents were still in his house. There was no crime, no visible threat, just an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that he had stumbled into a story far darker than anything he could comprehend. He drove home the image of Chris standing on the porch, a silent sentinel before an empty house, burned into his mind. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The memory of Derek's unsettling question, "You picked the wrong guy up tonight," now intertwined with Chris' desperate plea, "They're not gone yet." The next day, Mark reported the ride to Uber, but he knew it was futile. The system was designed for the mundane, for lost phones and forgotten wallets, not for encounters with the inexplicable. He also considered calling the police, but the thought of trying to explain the supernatural to a skeptical officer felt like a fool's errand. He hoped with a desperate sincerity that Chris was just having some kind of manic episode, that he wasn't truly trapped by something unseen. Months later, Mark was still driving for Uber, though with a newfound reluctance for night shifts. He avoided isolated areas, and every silent passenger was now a potential harbinger of something terrifying. Then came the third time. It wasn't a passenger this time, but an Uber Eats delivery. Mark, exhausted after a particularly long shift, decided to order in. He lived in a quiet apartment complex a few miles outside the city, and usually opted for contactless delivery. He made sure his instructions were clear: leave at door. He was cleaning a mundane ritual that helped ground him in the chaotic aftermath of his encounters. The notification pinged, "Your driver is on the way." A white Honda Fit Sport, a generic car, a generic name. Nothing to suggest the impending horror. He finished cleaning his stomach, grumbling. And then the notification, your food has been delivered. He rushed to the door, eager for his meal, but it wasn't there. He checked his immediate neighbor's doors, a faint unease stirring in his gut. Nothing. He was about to message the driver when a knock echoed through his apartment. It was his next-door neighbor holding a familiar brown paper bag. "Hey, sorry," his neighbor said, a hesitant frown on his face. "I picked up your food from your delivery driver. He was looking through your windows. I wasn't sure what he was doing." Mark's blood ran cold. The image of Derek staring at the back of his head of Chris, shining his phone light at him, flashed through his mind. He took the food, thanked his neighbor, and retreated into his apartment, a fresh wave of dread washing over him. He ate his food, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. He locked his doors, checked his windows, a ritual he now performed with meticulous precision. His small 5-pound terrier, Mix Buttons, a creature of pure, unadulterated joy, seemed uncharacteristically subdued. Mark finally drifted off to sleep, only to be jolted awake by a low growl from Buttons. The dog was standing by the window. Hackles raised a guttural sound, rumbling in his tiny chest. Mark tried to calm him, attributing it to a stray cat or a late-night jogger. He finally coaxed Buttons back to bed, his own nerves frayed. Not 15 minutes later, the banging started. Not a polite knock, but a heavy rhythmic thud against his bedroom window. Buttons erupted a frantic chorus of barks and whimpers. Mark froze, paralyzed by fear. His bedroom window, he remembered with a horrifying clarity, didn't lock properly. It could be easily lifted. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He whispered into the receiver, explaining to the operator that someone was in his backyard, that his window was unsecured. She told him to go to another room, that police were on their way. He stumbled into the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife he could find. He waited the silence of the apartment, punctuated by Buttons' frantic whimpers. He peered out the kitchen window, his eyes scanning the darkness. And then he saw it, parked across the street in the field used for parking trailers and dog walking, was a white Honda Fit Sport, the Uber Eats car. There was no one in it. A sickening realization dawned on Mark. The driver, he was in the backyard. The wail of sirens finally cut through the night, a symphony of relief and terror. Police cars flooded the street, their flashing lights painting the apartment complex in stark red and blue. Mark, shaking and crying, explained the situation to an officer. One officer went to check the backyard where Mark's bedroom window was. Another went to the abandoned Uber car. The first officer returned, his face grim. "Footprints in the mud," he said, his voice low. "It just rained last night." Mark's blood ran cold. The man was gone. He wasn't in the car and he wasn't in the backyard. Where was he? His neighbor, drawn by the commotion, came outside. He corroborated Mark's story about the driver looking through the windows. The neighbor, seeing Mark's distress, offered him a place to stay for the night. Mark oddly declined. He wanted to be in his own space, to feel a semblance of control. After the police left, promising increased patrols, Mark tried to sleep. He couldn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside sent shivers down his spine. He drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, a fragile peace that lasted until 2 a.m. A loud banging on his front door. Police. Mark stumbled out of bed, his heart pounding. He opened the door, and the female officer he had spoken to earlier stood there, a strange look on her face. "We caught him," she said, her voice quiet, almost subdued. "He came back. We were watching. He was walking up to your front door." Mark's knees buckled. He leaned against the doorframe, the adrenaline surge making him lightheaded. He imagined the driver, the silent stalker, trying to find a way in. "Has arrested," the officer continued. "You don't have to worry about him anymore." Mark thanked her, a choked whisper. He closed the door, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He didn't use Uber Eats anymore, not when he was alone. And he never drove for Uber again. The encounters, the unsettling quiet, the unblinking stares. The bizarre requests had taken their toll. He still didn't understand what had truly happened that night with Derek or with Chris. Were they simply disturbed individuals? Or had he, as Derek had so chillingly suggested, picked up the wrong person? He would never know. But the fear, the chilling realization that the mundane act of driving could expose him to such inexplicable horror remained. And every time he heard the distant hum of a car in the night or saw a silent figure standing under a dim light, he remembered. And he wondered if somewhere out there the wrong guy was still looking for the right car. The end. This story has now come to an end. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more thrilling and interesting horror stories, then don't forget to subscribe, like, and share my channel. Thank you for watching my video.